January 18th, 1945. In the pale, freezing light of dawn, the gates of a temporary prisoner of war holding camp in Western Germany groaned open. A column of women stumbled out into the snow, their movements jagged and desperate. They were skeletal, their eyes hollowed out by exhaustion. Some barely possessed the strength to remain upright. For 7 days, they had survived on almost nothing, a single crust of bread divided among 3 people, or handfuls of melted snow consumed like soup to stave off dehydration. Many in the line were convinced this march was their final journey, one that would end before a firing squad. But the scent that suddenly filled the air was not the acrid sting of gunpowder. It was the smell of food. They froze in their tracks. It was the unmistakable aroma of hot meat, rich and heavy in the cold air. These were not combat soldiers, but German women, prisoners of war who had served as auxiliary nurses, clerks, radio operators, and support staff for the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht, captured during the chaotic collapse of the Third Reich. Throughout their lives, the regime's propaganda machine had drilled a single terrifying narrative into their minds. Americans were brutal, immoral, and vengeful monsters. Their own officers had warned them that capture would result in unspeakable humiliation or immediate execution. Consequently, when the American soldiers gestured for them to move forward, terror took hold. Some of the women began to weep before a single order was given, anticipating the worst. According to official Red Cross reports and United States Army records, many of these prisoners had just survived weeks of a disorganized and harrowing retreat. They had witnessed trains being destroyed and supply lines vanishing, while their commanding officers disappeared in the night, leaving them stranded. Some of the women had not bathed in months. Others were still clad in blood-stained bandages they had applied themselves in the absence of medical care. By this point, hunger had evolved beyond a sensation of pain. It had become a profound, disorienting numbness. An American sergeant stood watch as one of the women suddenly collapsed into the mud, not from a specific injury, but from sheer physical depletion. He immediately shouted for medics, but before they could arrive, an unexpected scene unfolded. Another American soldier removed his steel helmet, filled it with hot stew from a nearby field kitchen, and knelt in the snow beside her. He did not force the food upon her. He simply waited. She stared at the steam, rising from the helmet, her body trembling uncontrollably. One woman later testified about that specific moment, recalling, "We thought it was a trick, that they wanted to see us beg." For a moment, no one moved. Then, the woman on the ground reached out with shaking hands and lifted the spoon. She took one bite, then another, and suddenly, the dam broke. She began to sob. That singular moment seemed to shatter the tension for everyone. As the rest of the women were guided indoors, they found long wooden tables already set for a meal. There was bread, potatoes, and meat. While some accounts describe a beef stew and others recall sausages, it was clear they were being served standard rations meant for the American troops that day. There were no press cameras to capture the scene, no political speeches, just standing orders. Feed them, warm them, and assess their condition. Several women initially refused to eat, paralyzed by fear. One whispered to her neighbor, "If we eat, they will punish us." Another asked aloud if this was their last meal before execution. A young American private, barely 20 years old, shook his head and spoke quietly to them. "No," he said, "you are safe now." That simple sentence, repeated again and again, began to dismantle years of indoctrination in a way that logic never could. As plates were passed down the tables, the atmosphere shifted. The only sounds at first were spoons scraping against tin, followed soon by the sound of choking sobs. One woman dropped her bread and buried her face in her hands, crying so hard she struggled to breathe. Another began to laugh hysterically, apologizing repeatedly in broken English. One survivor later recalled, "We ate nothing for a week. When the food touched my mouth, I realized I was still alive." Medical officers on the scene quickly recognized the physiological danger. Bodies that have been starved for so long cannot handle a sudden influx of rich food. They ordered the meal to be slowed down and the food watered down, while medics moved through the room monitoring pulses. Even with these precautions, some women fainted not from terror, but from the overwhelming shock of relief. What stunned the prisoners most, however, was not the food itself, but the conduct of their captors. There were no insults, no threats, and no unwanted physical contact. The guards maintained a respectful distance, simply handing out wool blankets to those who were shivering. Then, an American nurse entered the room. The sight of a woman in an American uniform caused several of the German prisoners to break down once more. They had been told that American women were savage, immoral, and cruel. Instead, she moved among them with compassion, checking their hands, feet, and eyes, speaking softly to them as patients rather than enemies. One former prisoner later reflected, "That was the moment I understood we had been lied to about everything." It is important to note that not all American camps were perfect. Historians are clear on this point. Conditions varied greatly, and supplies were often stretched to the breaking point. Yet, time and again, testimonies from female German prisoners of war describe this same emotional collapse when they encountered basic humanity, where they had been conditioned to expect brutality. That night, many of the women found they could not sleep. It was not fear that kept them awake, but the sensation of their own bodies unused to warmth and fullness, struggling to understand how to rest. In the darkness, some whispered to one another, asking the same question: why are they doing this? For some, the answer would take decades to fully comprehend. Years later, during post-war interviews in Germany, several women admitted they had never spoken of that meal to anyone, not to their husbands, nor their children. In the ruins of post-war Europe, it was often easier to discuss suffering than to recount kindness received from the enemy. But privately, many carried that memory for the rest of their lives. One woman summed it up with simple clarity: "I expected to die that morning. Instead, someone fed me." In a conflict defined by industrial cruelty, that single act of humanity became impossible to forget. History often records the battles, the statistics, and the dates. But it is moments like this that reveal the true nature of the human spirit, when fear meets compassion, and enemies see each other not as uniforms, but as people. If this story resonated with you, do not let it end here. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this history with others.